John Allen Muhammad will be executed later this evening at 9 o'clock here at the Greensville Correctional Facility in Jarrett, Virginia. It will be the 99th such execution here, this one done by lethal injection. It was a terrorizing 3 weeks during October of 2002. When the smoke cleared from John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo's killing spree, 10 people had been killed in 4 states, including Alabama and Louisiana, and 6 people were wounded. Both Muhammad and Malvo were convicted. Malvo was sentenced to life and Muhammad to death. Muhammad now sits on Virginia's death row here at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia.
It was October 2002 in the tranquil suburbs surrounding Washington, D.C. Autumn leaves covered the sidewalks, children waited for school buses, and commuters filled gas stations on their way to work. The air was ordinary, peaceful, and routine. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Without warning, a single gunshot cracked the calm of Montgomery County, Maryland. A man buying groceries was shot dead in broad daylight. Minutes later, another, then another. 10 innocent lives would fall in just 3 weeks, each one taken by a hidden hand, a single bullet, and a distant eye watching from the shadows. 17 dead, 10 wounded across the nation. Shot with planning and precision, without conscience or prejudice. The victims were young and old, black and white, men and women. Their deaths came at gas stations and parking lots, on street corners and school steps, in moments when they felt most ordinary and safe. No one saw the killer. There were no patterns beyond randomness, no clear motives, no mercy. People began to run in zigzag patterns when pumping gas. Schools kept children indoors during recess. Parents refused to let kids take school buses. Fear spread faster than news could keep up. The killer was everywhere, and nowhere at once. Police described it as if a ghost were moving methodically through Montgomery County, executing victims at random. It felt like we were always moving behind. One officer recalled, "We couldn't get ahead of what he was doing. It was like chasing shadows." For millions of people in the Washington, D.C. region, it sent one chilling message. Everyone was at risk. You could be shot while mowing a lawn, filling your gas tank, waiting for a bus, loading groceries into your car, or simply walking home. The most mundane activities of daily life had become potentially fatal. "I felt like the water was over my head," one resident recalled. The entire region held its breath for 3 weeks, wondering when and where the sniper would strike next, and whether they or someone they loved would be the next victim. Montgomery County was a small, wealthy suburb just north of Washington, D.C. Until October 2002, it had an annual homicide rate of just 15 to 20 murders a year. But that October, everything changed. In just 23 days, the body count in this quiet community would rival an entire year's worth of violence. It started on a beautiful Wednesday evening at a Shoppers Food Warehouse in Wheaton, Maryland. The parking lot was well lit and crowded. People were coming to buy their groceries after work, just a normal day. One of the cashiers inside had been standing at her register, doing her job, when a bullet came through the window close by her head. She didn't even realize what had happened. 40 minutes later that same evening, there was another shooting. James Martin, a 55-year-old man walking across the busy supermarket parking lot, was shot in the back and killed. Police were unnerved by the random murder and the skill of the executioner. "We didn't have a lot of evidence," one officer recalled. "It did seem strange. We didn't really anticipate what would happen next." What happened next was unprecedented. The following morning at 7:41, officers received a page saying a man had been killed while on a lawnmower. The message said the lawnmower had exploded. It seemed very unusual. James Buchanan, a 39-year-old landscaper, had been shot in the back and killed while mowing grass at an auto mall. But the pages were coming through quickly. 31 minutes later, another alert. There had been a shooting at a mobile gas station. Premkumar Walekar, a 54-year-old taxi driver, was killed by a single gunshot to the chest while pumping fuel. "Maybe it's terrorism for real," someone said. What better way to terrorize a neighborhood than to start killing people at random in different places, all within a given area? 25 minutes later, outside a post office at Leisure World Shopping Center, Sarah Ramos was sitting on a bench. She was killed by a bullet to the head. Then, at a Shell gas station in Kensington, Lori Ann Lewis Rivera was vacuuming her van. She was shot and killed. 4 people dead within an hour. 5 dead by the end of the day. It was like a ghost moving methodically through the county, shooting people indiscriminately. The sniper's high-powered rifle sent shockwaves across the entire country. People couldn't believe that someone like this existed in their world, that someone could kill so casually, so efficiently, with such apparent ease. One of the largest manhunts in American history spread from coast to coast. Hundreds of FBI agents, ATF specialists, state police, and local officers worked around the clock. There were countless false leads, dead ends, and moments of panic. Police stopped thousands of white vans based on witness reports. Roadblocks paralyzed traffic. Helicopters circled overhead. But the killer remained invisible. From a historical context, serial killers generally operate at a much different pace. They kill, then disappear for weeks or months before striking again. But this one was hunting in real time, attacking multiple times in a single day, moving through communities with military precision. What investigators didn't yet know was that the ghost had a name. John Allen Muhammad, a 41-year-old former Gulf War veteran with expert marksmanship skills. And he wasn't working alone. His accomplice was Boyd Malvo, a 17-year-old teenager Muhammad had groomed and trained to kill. Together they had transformed a 1990 blue Chevrolet Caprice into a mobile sniper's nest, a murder machine disguised as an ordinary car. Muhammad had cut a hole in the trunk near the license plate and removed the barrier between the trunk and passenger compartment. Malvo would lie in the trunk with a stolen Bushmaster rifle, aim through the small hole, fire a single shot, and retreat back into the car while Muhammad drove away. From outside, the vehicle looked completely normal. When investigators finally caught them sleeping at a rest stop in Maryland on October 24, 2002, the weapon was still inside the trunk, the rifle hole still visible. After 7 years on death row, John Allen Muhammad faced his fate inside Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. It was November 10, 2009. The man once known as the Beltway Sniper lay motionless on a gurney. At 9:11 p.m., he was pronounced dead, silent, unrepentant, still carrying the same chilling composure that had once paralyzed an entire region. He was 48 years old, executed for crimes that turned ordinary life in America's capital into a waking nightmare. But before the execution, before the trials and convictions, before the 3 weeks of terror in October 2002, there was a boy from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, who lost his mother at age 3 and grew up angry at the world. There was a teenager from Jamaica who needed a father and found a predator instead. Their paths should never have crossed. If they hadn't met, 17 people might still be alive. This is their story, from beginning to end. From the childhoods that shaped them to the crimes that defined them, from the investigation that caught them to the justice that followed. Nothing is left out. Every victim will be remembered. Every detail will be examined. Every question will be explored. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences, the darkest corners of human decision, broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. John Allen Williams came into the world on December 31, 1960, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. His parents, Ernest and Eva Williams, struggled to make ends meet in the segregated South. When John was still a toddler, his mother received a breast cancer diagnosis. The family moved to New Orleans seeking better medical care, but Eva Williams died when John was only 3 years old. His father left shortly after his mother's death. Young John moved in with his maternal grandfather and an aunt who took on the responsibility of raising him. The absence of both parents shaped his early years in ways that would become clear much later. John grew up in a household without the structure that two parents typically provide. His grandfather did his best, but the loss of his mother at such a young age left a mark. School records show John was an average student who kept mostly to himself. He had friends, but never formed deep connections with peers. As a teenager, John began to search for direction. He watched older men in his neighborhood, some who had served in the military, and saw a potential path forward. The military offered structure, discipline, and a way out of Louisiana. It represented everything his childhood had lacked. At 18, in August 1978, John enlisted in the Louisiana Army National Guard. He chose combat engineering as his specialty. The military gave him what he had been searching for: rules, expectations, and a clear chain of command. For the first time since his mother's death, John had stability. He performed well enough in his initial service that on November 6, 1985, he transferred to the regular Army. The transition meant more training and new skills. The Army trained him as a mechanic, a truck driver, and a specialist metal worker. He learned how to fix vehicles, operate heavy equipment, and work with metal fabrication. But it was his rifle training that would prove most significant. John qualified with the M16 rifle, the standard weapon for Army soldiers. He didn't just pass the basic requirements. He earned the Expert Rifleman's Badge, the highest of 3 marksmanship levels the Army awards to regular soldiers. This meant John could consistently hit targets at distances ranging from 50 to 300 meters. He had to score at least 36 out of 40 targets to achieve this rating. His first official tour sent him to Fort Lewis in 1985 with the 15th Engineer Battalion. He settled into military life, following orders and completing his duties. The structure worked for him. He rose through the ranks steadily, showing competence, if not exceptional talent. Then, in 1991, the Gulf War called. John deployed with his unit to the Middle East. His company had a specific and dangerous job: dismantling Iraqi chemical warfare rockets. This work required precision, care, and nerve. One mistake could be fatal. John completed his deployment and returned home with 3 medals: the South Asia Service Medal, the Kuwait Liberation Medal from Saudi Arabia, and the Kuwait Liberation Medal from Kuwait. He had proven himself in combat conditions. The military had given him purpose, identity, and recognition. By the time Sergeant John Williams received his honorable discharge in April 1994, he had served for 16 years. He left the Army with skills, discipline, and expert marksmanship training. But he also left with something less tangible: a belief in his own capabilities with a rifle that few civilians could match. This confidence, combined with the training he received, would become important years later. For now, though, John Williams was simply a veteran returning to civilian life, searching once again for direction and purpose. Civilian life proved harder than John Williams expected. The structure and clear purpose that defined his military years disappeared overnight. When he left the Army in April 1994 after 16 years of service, he thought his skills and discipline would translate easily. They didn't. Williams tried working as a mechanic, using the training the Army had given him. He found jobs at repair shops but couldn't stay long. The work felt meaningless compared to military service. He had no mission, no rank, no unit. Just oil changes and brake repairs for customers who didn't appreciate his expertise. He moved between jobs frequently. Auto shops, security positions, odd jobs. Nothing held his interest. The problem wasn't the work itself, but the absence of structure and purpose. In the military, every task connected to a larger mission. Orders came down the chain of command. Success was measured and recognized. Civilian work felt empty by comparison. His first marriage had already ended in divorce. The details of this marriage remain sparse in public records, but the relationship failed while he was still in the Army. He had no children from this first marriage. In 1987, while still serving, Williams made a decision that would reshape his identity. At age 26, he joined the Nation of Islam, an African-American religious and political organization founded in the 1930s. The Nation of Islam taught that Black Americans were the original people and that white society had oppressed them systematically. The organization promoted Black self-sufficiency, discipline, and separation from white America. Williams changed his name to John Allen Muhammad. In Islam, Muhammad is the name of the Prophet, and taking this name signified deep commitment to the faith. But his conversion was specifically to the Nation of Islam's version, which differed significantly from mainstream Islam. The Nation of Islam focused heavily on racial identity and politics alongside religious teachings. The organization gave Muhammad structure similar to what the military had provided. The Nation of Islam demanded discipline from members. They had to dress properly, speak respectfully, avoid drugs and alcohol, and follow strict behavioral codes. Muhammad thrived under these expectations. He attended meetings at Nation of Islam mosques, called temples. He studied the writings of Elijah Muhammad, the organization's longtime leader, and listened to sermons by Louis Farrakhan, who led the Nation of Islam in the 1980s and 1990s. The teachings about black pride and white oppression resonated deeply with Muhammad. In 1995, the Nation of Islam organized the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. The event called for black men to gather on the National Mall to demonstrate unity and commitment to improving their communities. Organizers expected maybe 200,000 participants. An estimated 400,000 to 850,000 men actually attended, making it one of the largest gatherings in Washington history. Muhammad volunteered to provide security for the march. He wore a suit and stood in assigned positions, helping manage crowds and watching for threats. Being part of this massive demonstration of black solidarity gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since leaving the military. He stood shoulder to shoulder with thousands of men, all committed to the same cause. For a day, he belonged to something bigger than himself again. After the march, Muhammad returned to normal life, but the experience stayed with him. He had glimpsed the kind of belonging and purpose he craved. Regular civilian work couldn't compete with that feeling. His second marriage to Mildred brought 3 children, a son and 2 daughters. For a while, family life provided purpose. Muhammad worked to support them. He tried to be a good father and husband, but his personality began to change in ways that frightened Mildred. Muhammad became increasingly controlling. He wanted to know where Mildred went, who she talked to, and what she did every moment. He monitored her activities obsessively. When she didn't follow his expectations, he became angry and threatening. Mildred tried to make the marriage work for the children's sake. She hoped Muhammad would calm down and return to the man she had married. Instead, his behavior worsened. He made threats against her. He talked about killing her or taking the children where she could never find them. In 1998, Mildred decided she had to protect herself and the children. She filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order requiring Muhammad to stay away from her. The court granted her custody of the 3 children. Muhammad was allowed supervised visitation but could not take them alone. The custody decision destroyed Muhammad. He believed the children belonged with him. He thought the court system had unjustly taken his family away. His anger toward Mildred intensified. He blamed her for everything wrong in his life. Friends later testified that Muhammad talked constantly about getting his children back, whatever it took. In early 1999, during a supervised visit, Muhammad violated the custody order. He took all 3 children and disappeared. Mildred came to pick them up and found them gone. She immediately called police and reported the kidnapping. Authorities issued warrants for Muhammad's arrest, but he had already left the state. Muhammad drove across the country with his 3 kidnapped children. He used stolen credit cards to buy gas and food. He used forged documents to move around without detection. He eventually boarded a plane to Antigua, a small island nation in the Caribbean. He chose Antigua because it had no extradition treaty with the United States, meaning American authorities couldn't force him to return. In Antigua, Muhammad rented a small place and tried to establish a normal life with his children. He found work at an electronics store. He enrolled the children in school. He told people he was a single father, making a fresh start. No one suspected he was a fugitive who had kidnapped his own kids. Muhammad spent his days working and his nights consumed by anger. He was angry at Mildred for divorcing him, angry at the court system for taking his children, angry at American society for what he perceived as systematic injustice. His mind circled these grievances constantly. He began planning revenge. He didn't know exactly what form it would take, but he knew he wanted to hurt those who had hurt him. He wanted to make powerful people feel powerless. He wanted to create fear and chaos. These thoughts occupied more and more of his mental space. Muhammad needed help to carry out any plan. He was one person with limited resources, but soon he would meet someone perfect for his purposes. A vulnerable, abandoned teenager desperate for a father figure and willing to do anything for approval and belonging. That teenager walked into the electronics store where Muhammad worked sometime in late 1999 or early 2000. His name was Lee Boyd Malvo, and meeting John Allen Muhammad was the worst thing that would ever happen to him. Lee Boyd Malvo was born on February 18, 1985, in Kingston, Jamaica. His mother, Una Sion James, was a single parent struggling to provide for her son. His father was absent from the beginning. Una worked multiple jobs to keep them afloat, but stability was hard to find. Lee bounced between relatives as his mother searched for work. He stayed with his grandmother, then an aunt, then back to his mother. Each move meant new schools, new neighborhoods, new faces. He never stayed anywhere long enough to form lasting friendships. The pattern continued throughout his childhood. Una James loved her son but was often too busy working to spend time with him. Lee learned early how to take care of himself. He came home to empty apartments, made his own meals, and did his homework alone. School records from Jamaica show Lee was intelligent but withdrawn. Teachers noted he had potential but seemed distracted. He struggled to focus in class and rarely participated in group activities. Other children saw him as the quiet kid who kept to himself. At home, Lee faced challenges beyond his mother's absence. He later disclosed to therapists and attorneys that starting at age 5, a babysitter sexually abused him. He said this abuse continued with different family members throughout his childhood. These experiences, which he kept secret for years, shaped his understanding of relationships and trust. Una James wanted better opportunities for her son. Jamaica's economy offered limited prospects, especially for single mothers. She heard about work opportunities in Antigua and decided to move. In 1999, when Lee was 14, they relocated to the island. Antigua was supposed to be a fresh start. Una found work, and Lee enrolled in a new school. But within months, Una learned about a job opportunity in Fort Myers, Florida. The pay was better than anything available in Antigua. She made a difficult choice. She would go to Florida first, establish herself, and then send for Lee. This decision left 14-year-old Lee alone in Antigua. Una arranged for him to stay with friends while she got situated in the United States. She promised it would only be temporary. She would send for him as soon as she could afford it. Lee found himself once again in a pattern he knew too well, waiting, alone, for his mother to come back. He attended school but struggled to concentrate. He had no close friends on the island. He spent most of his time by himself, reading or wandering around the neighborhood. He needed a father figure, someone to provide the guidance and stability his life had always lacked. He was vulnerable, searching for belonging, desperate for someone to pay attention to him. This made him the perfect target for someone like John Muhammad. In late 1999, Lee walked into an electronics store in Antigua. The exact date isn't recorded, but what happened there changed both their lives. Behind the counter stood John Muhammad, working a temporary job while hiding from American authorities with his kidnapped children. Their eyes met. They started talking. Lee was 15 years old, alone, and looking for a father. Muhammad was 40, on the run, and looking for something too, though Lee couldn't have known what that was. The friendship between Muhammad and Malvo developed quickly. Muhammad recognized something in the teenage boy: loneliness, vulnerability, and a desperate need for approval. Lee saw in Muhammad the father figure he'd never had. Muhammad was confident, well-spoken, and interested in him. For Lee, this attention felt like everything he'd been missing. Muhammad told Lee to call him by his first name. He invited the teenager to visit him at work. They talked about religion, politics, and life. Muhammad shared his views on the world, speaking with the authority of someone who had served in the military and traveled. Lee listened closely to every word. Within weeks, Lee was spending more time with Muhammad than with anyone else. Muhammad bought him meals, gave him small gifts, and treated him like a son. He told Lee about his own 3 children, though he didn't mention he had kidnapped them. Muhammad presented himself as a devoted father trying to make a life for his kids. Under Una James' approval, Muhammad moved Lee temporarily into his apartment. She saw a responsible adult who seemed to care about her son. Muhammad began Lee's education in earnest. He taught him about the Nation of Islam and its teachings. He spoke about black pride, self-sufficiency, and the wrongs committed against African Americans throughout history. Lee absorbed these lessons. Muhammad represented knowledge and strength. In March 2001, Muhammad converted Lee to Islam. This was more than a religious conversion. It was another step in Muhammad's process of reshaping Lee's identity. Lee began to see the world through Muhammad's eyes. He accepted Muhammad's interpretations of events without question. Muhammad also began isolating Lee from his mother. This isolation was systematic and deliberate, a textbook grooming technique used by predators. When Una called from Florida to check on her son, Muhammad controlled the conversations. Sometimes he told Lee his mother had called when she hadn't, claiming she asked about him but was too busy to talk long. Other times, when Una actually did call, Muhammad simply didn't tell Lee. He would answer the phone, speak briefly with Una, and then hang up without mentioning it to Lee. Muhammad crafted a narrative designed to break the bond between mother and son. He told Lee that Una had chosen money over family. He pointed out that she left Lee behind in Antigua while she went to pursue work in America. He reminded Lee of all the times throughout his childhood when Una was absent, working multiple jobs, leaving him with relatives. Muhammad reframed these sacrifices Una made to provide for her son as evidence that she didn't really love him. "She could have stayed here with you," Muhammad would say. "She could have found work in Antigua, but America was more important to her than you were." The manipulation went deeper than just words. Muhammad became Lee's entire world. He provided food, shelter, and emotional support. He taught Lee about religion and politics. He trained him physically. He gave him structure and purpose. Lee had never experienced this level of consistent attention from an adult. He became completely dependent on Muhammad for everything. The relationship between them grew more complex and darker. Muhammad sexually abused him during this period in Antigua. In a 2012 interview, Lee would later tell a reporter that Muhammad compared their relationship to what a pimp does to a woman. This comparison, disturbing as it was, accurately described the power dynamic. Muhammad had complete control. Lee felt he couldn't say no. He believed he had nowhere else to go and no one else who cared about him. In early 2001, Muhammad told Lee they needed to leave Antigua. He explained that American authorities were getting closer to finding him and the 3 kidnapped children. Muhammad had been careful, using false documents and staying off official records, but he knew his time on the island was limited. Someone might recognize the children. Someone might report him to authorities. He needed to move. Muhammad made plans to return to the United States despite the outstanding warrants for his arrest. He obtained false documents for himself and Lee. He had already been living under false pretenses with forged identification, so getting more fake papers was simply an extension of his existing criminal activity. They traveled to Miami with Muhammad's 3 children. The journey involved multiple flights and careful movement through airports where Muhammad hoped no one would recognize him. Lee entered the United States completely illegally. He had no visa, no passport, no legal documentation. He simply followed Muhammad, who told him where to go and what to do. Lee never questioned any of this. By this point, Muhammad's control over him was total. If Muhammad said they were going to Miami, they went to Miami. If Muhammad said to use false documents, Lee used false documents. The teenager who had walked into that electronics store in Antigua searching for a father figure had been transformed into someone who would follow Muhammad anywhere, do anything Muhammad asked. From Miami, the group made their way north to Fort Myers, Florida. This was where Una James had been working for months, sending money back when she could, trying to establish herself so she could eventually bring Lee to live with her permanently. Muhammad knew exactly where to find her. When Una opened her door and saw her son, she was overwhelmed with emotion. She hadn't seen Lee in months. She hugged him and cried. She was grateful to Muhammad for bringing Lee safely to Florida. She had no idea what had been happening to her son during the time they were separated. Muhammad reunited Lee with his mother, but he didn't leave. He stayed in Fort Myers, inserting himself into their household. He told Una that Lee needed male guidance and structure. He offered to help raise Lee while Una worked. Una, who was struggling financially and working long hours, saw this as generous support. This arrangement continued for some time in Florida. But Muhammad had larger plans. He told Lee about opportunities in Washington state. He said they could both work there and Lee could attend better schools. He painted a picture of a fresh start in Bellingham, a small city near the Canadian border where Muhammad claimed to have connections. Una, once again focused on her work and trusting Muhammad's judgment, agreed to let Lee go to Washington with him. She thought this was a temporary arrangement that would benefit her son. She had no way of knowing she was sending Lee away with someone who was systematically destroying his sense of self and preparing him to become a killer. This decision would haunt her for the rest of her life. In late 2001, Muhammad and Lee traveled across the country to Bellingham. Muhammad enrolled Lee in Bellingham High School, falsely listing himself as Lee's father on the paperwork. Lee attended classes under the name John Lee Malvo, taking Muhammad's first name as his own. Lee's classmates later described him as quiet and distant. He didn't make friends. He didn't join clubs or sports teams. He came to school, sat through classes, and left. Teachers found him polite but disconnected. No one suspected what was happening at home. Muhammad and Lee lived in a homeless shelter in Bellingham. They slept in bunk beds surrounded by other displaced people. But even in this crowded space, Lee remained isolated. Muhammad was his only constant companion, his only source of guidance and approval. In early 2002, Muhammad's plans for Lee Malvo became clear and concrete. The abstract talk about revenge and making a statement transformed into practical preparation. Muhammad began weapons training that went far beyond anything Lee had experienced. This wasn't teaching a teenager to shoot targets for sport. This was creating a killer. Muhammad took Lee to remote forested areas outside Bellingham, Washington. They drove miles from the city, finding logging roads and abandoned trails where gunshots wouldn't attract attention. The Pacific Northwest offered countless isolated locations perfect for their purposes. Muhammad selected spots carefully, always considering sight lines, escape routes, and the likelihood of encountering other people. The training started with basics. Lee had never fired a gun before meeting Muhammad. He had never held a rifle or understood how firearms worked. Muhammad began with safety procedures, not out of concern for Lee's well-being, but because accidents would interfere with his plans. Lee learned how to check if a weapon was loaded, how to engage and disengage safeties, and how to handle firearms without dropping them or shooting himself. Then came marksmanship instruction. Muhammad taught Lee everything the army had taught him. He showed Lee how to hold a rifle properly, tucking the stock against his shoulder, keeping his elbow down, maintaining a stable platform. He explained sight alignment and sight picture, teaching Lee to focus on the front sight while keeping the target and rear sight slightly blurred. Breathing control was critical. Muhammad drilled Lee on the natural respiratory pause that occurs after exhaling, the moment when the body is most still. Take your shot in that pause, Muhammad instructed. Breathe in, breathe out halfway, hold it, squeeze the trigger. Lee practiced this breathing pattern hundreds of times until it became automatic. As Lee improved, Muhammad increased the difficulty. He moved targets farther away, forcing Lee to estimate distance and adjust his aim. He made Lee shoot from different positions, standing, kneeling, prone, sitting. He timed Lee's shots, pushing him to fire accurately under pressure. He created scenarios where Lee had to identify which target to hit first among multiple options. But Muhammad didn't just teach Lee how to shoot. He taught him how to think like a sniper. They discussed concealment and how to select shooting positions that offered cover and escape routes. Muhammad explained ballistics, how wind affects bullets, how gravity pulls them down over distance, how different ammunition performs. He taught Lee to read terrain and identify vulnerable targets. Most importantly, Muhammad worked to eliminate any hesitation Lee might feel about shooting people. During their training sessions, Muhammad talked constantly about targets. He never called them people or victims. They were always targets or objects. He desensitized Lee to the idea of killing through repetition and depersonalization. Muhammad filled their training time with ideological conditioning. He talked endlessly about injustice, corruption, and the need for action. He told Lee that society had failed both of them. He painted vivid pictures of the world they would create after completing their mission. Lee absorbed all of this. In February 2002, Muhammad decided Lee was ready for his first real test. He identified a specific target with personal significance: Tanya Nicole Cook, a 21-year-old woman living in Tacoma. The target wasn't Cook herself, but her aunt, Isa Nichols. Nichols had a history with Muhammad that made her, in his mind, deserving of death. Years earlier, Nichols had worked for Muhammad's auto repair business and had been friends with both Muhammad and his ex-wife Mildred. When Muhammad's marriage collapsed and he became increasingly abusive, Nichols sided with Mildred. She encouraged Mildred to file for divorce. She helped Mildred contact police when Muhammad kidnapped their children. She testified in court during the custody proceedings. Muhammad never forgave her. In his distorted worldview, Nichols was responsible for destroying his family. She had turned his wife against him. She had helped authorities take his children. She deserved to die, and her death would serve multiple purposes: revenge and a test of Lee's ability to follow through on killing a real person. Muhammad drove Lee to the house on East 34th Street in Tacoma on February 16, 2002. It was evening when they arrived. Muhammad pointed out the home and gave Lee his orders. The instructions were clear: knock on the door, shoot whoever answers, and return immediately to the car. Muhammad had borrowed a .45 caliber handgun from a friend, telling the friend they needed it for target practice. He gave this gun to Lee. A handgun made more sense at close range than a rifle. Muhammad parked down the street where he could watch the house, but wouldn't be immediately connected to what was about to happen. Lee walked up to the front door. Inside, Tanya Cook was alone with her 6-month-old baby daughter. Cook was staying with her aunt, Isa Nichols, to escape her own troubles with an abusive boyfriend. She thought the house was a safe haven. She was changing her daughter's diaper when the doorbell rang. Cook walked to the door and opened it. She saw a teenager standing there. Before she could speak or react, Lee fired once. The .45 caliber bullet struck her in the face at point-blank range. Cook died instantly, collapsing in the doorway. Her baby remained on the changing table, unharmed but now motherless. Lee turned and walked back to the car with mechanical precision, just as Muhammad had instructed. The Tacoma Police Department investigated Cook's murder thoroughly, but had almost nothing to work with. There were no witnesses to the actual shooting. Neighbors heard a gunshot, but hadn't seen the shooter clearly. The crime seemed random and motiveless. Detectives had no reason to connect it to Muhammad or Malvo. The .45 caliber handgun would eventually be traced back to the friend who had loaned it to Muhammad. But that wouldn't happen until after Muhammad and Lee were arrested 8 months later for the DC sniper attacks. For now, Tanya Cook's case went cold. Muhammad and Lee left Washington State shortly after the murder. They drove south through Oregon and California, then turned east. Muhammad kept them moving, never staying anywhere long enough to establish patterns or attract attention. They slept in the car most nights, occasionally checking into cheap motels where Muhammad paid cash and used false names. In March 2002, they reached Tucson, Arizona. Muhammad had family there, a younger sister who lived near the Fred Enke golf course. Muhammad visited his sister, maintaining the appearance of a normal family relationship while planning his next attack. Muhammad selected Jerry Taylor as his next victim. Taylor was a 60-year-old retiree who loved golf. He spent his days at the Fred Enke golf course, practicing his short game and enjoying retirement. He had no connection to Muhammad, no history with him, nothing that would explain why he became a target. Muhammad chose him simply because he was available and vulnerable. On March 19, 2002, Taylor was at the practice area working on his chip shots. The area was relatively isolated, with few other golfers around. Muhammad positioned himself at a distance with a rifle. This time, Muhammad appears to have pulled the trigger himself, rather than having Lee do it. The specific dynamics of who shot whom in these early killings remained unclear even after their arrests, as both Muhammad and Lee gave conflicting accounts. A single shot rang out across the golf course. The bullet struck Taylor in the chest. He collapsed on the practice green. Other golfers heard the shot and rushed over. They found Taylor bleeding and unconscious. An ambulance arrived quickly, but Taylor died from his injuries. He had been targeted randomly while pursuing a hobby he loved in a place he felt safe. Tucson police investigated the murder, but had little to work with. The shooter had fired from a distance, leaving no shell casings at the scene that could be easily found. No one saw the shooter or could provide useful descriptions. Detectives interviewed Taylor's family and friends. Searching for anyone who might want him dead, they found nothing. Taylor had no enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would target him. The case went cold like Kenya Cook's murder had. Muhammad and Lee left Arizona and continued their journey east. They drove through New Mexico, Texas, and other states, constantly moving. Muhammad kept them below the radar, avoiding anything that might attract police attention. They obeyed traffic laws, paid for everything with cash, and stayed in places where people didn't ask questions. In the late spring and summer of 2002, Muhammad and Lee committed additional crimes as they made their way across the country. They shot several more people in various states, some fatally. In Louisiana, Texas, and Florida, victims were targeted in what appeared to be random attacks. These shootings continued Muhammad's pattern of testing weapons, testing Lee, and refining their methods. The August 1, 2002 shooting in Hammond, Louisiana, demonstrated Muhammad's evolving tactics. They needed money, so they combined violence with robbery. Lee slashed the tire of a car driven by John Gaeta, a 51-year-old man. This created a situation where Gaeta would be stationary and vulnerable. When Gaeta discovered his flat tire and started changing it in a parking lot, Lee approached and shot him in the neck with a .22 caliber revolver. The bullet entered one side of Gaeta's neck and exited through his back. Gaeta immediately fell to the ground. He realized that if he moved, the shooter might fire again to ensure he was dead. So Gaeta lay completely still, pretending to be dead, while Lee stood over him. Lee took Gaeta's wallet from his pocket, then walked away. Only after Lee was gone did Gaeta dare to move. He got up and ran to a nearby service station, shouting for help. Workers there called an ambulance. Gaeta was bleeding heavily from the neck wounds, but the bullet had miraculously missed major arteries. He was treated at a hospital and released within hours. He had survived by quick thinking and extraordinary luck. This shooting showed Muhammad's escalating aggression and his willingness to commit robberies alongside murders. It also showed Lee was now comfortable approaching victims directly, shooting them at close range and stealing from them. The transformation from isolated teenager to violent criminal was complete. By late summer 2002, Muhammad decided they needed better equipment. The various handguns and rifles they had been using were adequate for close-range shootings, but Muhammad's plans required something more powerful and accurate. He wanted a rifle that could kill from hundreds of meters away, a rifle that would give them the range and precision necessary for the attacks he was planning in Washington, D.C. Muhammad knew exactly what he wanted: a Bushmaster XM15, the civilian semi-automatic version of the military M16 rifle he had trained with in the Army. This rifle fired .223 caliber ammunition, the same as the M16. It was accurate, reliable, and powerful enough to kill with a single shot at considerable distances. It was also expensive, costing around $1,000. Muhammad couldn't legally purchase the rifle. He had a restraining order against him from his ex-wife, which made it illegal under federal law for him to buy or possess firearms. Even if he tried to use false identification, the background check system might flag him. So Muhammad decided to steal one. He drove Lee back across the country to Washington State, specifically to Tacoma, where they had lived earlier. Muhammad knew about Bullseye Shooter Supply, a gun store with a terrible reputation for security and record-keeping. The store had been cited repeatedly by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives for violations. Guns disappeared from Bullseye's inventory regularly, with no explanation for where they went. Muhammad and Lee visited Bullseye in early September 2002. They looked at various firearms on display. Muhammad pointed out the Bushmaster XM15 to Lee and gave him simple instructions: take it and walk out. The store's lax security and poor inventory management meant store employees often didn't notice when guns went missing until long after the fact. Lee, who had by now committed multiple shootings and robberies, had no hesitation about theft. He waited for an opportune moment when employees were distracted, then took the Bushmaster rifle and walked out of the store. No one stopped him. No alarms went off. They got in their car and drove away. Bullseye Shooter Supply wouldn't realize the rifle was missing for some time. When they finally noticed it was gone from inventory, they had no record of selling it and no explanation for its disappearance. They reported it to ATF as missing, but by then, Muhammad and Lee were long gone. Muhammad now had the weapon he needed. He drove Lee back across the United States to the East Coast, making their way toward the Washington, D.C. area. But first, he needed to solve another problem: how to shoot people from concealment without being seen. On September 11, 2002, Muhammad stopped in New Jersey and purchased a used blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice. The car had previously been used as an undercover police vehicle by the Bordentown Police Department before being sold at auction. It was unremarkable looking, the kind of sedan that blended into traffic. Muhammad paid cash for it and registered the vehicle in his own name using the license plate number NDA21Z. Muhammad chose this specific type of car for a reason. The Caprice was large, with a spacious trunk and a back seat that could be modified. It was mechanically reliable and wouldn't break down during their operations. Most importantly, as a former police car, it looked authoritative and wouldn't attract suspicion from actual police who might pass it on the road. Muhammad immediately began modifying the Caprice to serve as a mobile sniper platform. He found a location where he could work on the car without being observed or interrupted. Using basic hand tools, Muhammad cut a hole in the trunk lid near where the license plate was attached. The hole was approximately 2 inches in diameter, large enough to fit a rifle barrel through, but small enough to be inconspicuous from a distance. The modification required precision. If the hole was too large, it would be visible and suspicious. If it was too small, it would restrict the rifle's movement and limit shooting angles. Next, Muhammad removed the sheet metal panel that separated the passenger compartment from the trunk. This involved removing the back seat, accessing the trunk from inside the car, and cutting the metal barrier. The modification created a passageway large enough for a person to crawl through. This design meant Lee could sit normally in the back seat while Muhammad drove. When they spotted a target, Lee could climb through the opening into the trunk without Muhammad stopping the car or either of them exiting the vehicle. Once in the trunk, Lee could lie flat, position the Bushmaster rifle so its barrel extended through the hole near the license plate, aim through the rifle's scope, and fire. After shooting, Lee could pull back into the passenger compartment, and Muhammad could drive away immediately. Muhammad tested the setup extensively. He drove to empty areas, had Lee practice climbing into the trunk, and verified that Lee could aim and fire comfortably from inside. They practiced the timing, how long it took Lee to get into position, how quickly they could leave after a shot, how the rifle's report sounded from inside the trunk. Lee discovered that firing from inside the trunk was actually easier than shooting from standing positions. Lying prone provided a stable platform. The trunk's walls protected him from wind. The confined space helped him stay focused on the target. Muhammad was satisfied with the results. Now came the final phase of preparation. Muhammad wanted to test their complete system, the modified Caprice, the Bushmaster rifle, and Lee's training before launching the major attacks. He needed to verify everything worked as planned in real conditions with real targets. These final tests would also serve to confuse police by creating separate incidents that wouldn't immediately be connected to the later attacks. Muhammad drove south from New Jersey into Maryland. He had selected the Washington, D.C. area specifically because it was the nation's capital. Attacks there would receive maximum media attention. The symbolism of terrorizing the seat of the American government appealed to Muhammad's desire to strike at the system he blamed for his problems. But before attacking in the D.C. area itself, Muhammad wanted to conduct several shootings in the Maryland suburbs. These would be dress rehearsals, allowing him to test their equipment and methods while police were unprepared and unaware of what was coming. Each shooting would refine their technique and build Lee's confidence. On September 5, 2002, Muhammad and Lee drove through Clinton, Maryland, a suburb in Prince George's County, just south of Washington, D.C. Clinton was far enough from the city to avoid heavy police presence, but close enough to the Capitol Beltway for quick access to multiple escape routes. This made it ideal for Muhammad's purposes. Around 10:30 p.m., they found their target. Paul LaRuffa, a 55-year-old restaurant owner, was closing Margellina, his Italian restaurant. LaRuffa had owned the restaurant for years and had built a loyal customer base. He was known in the community as hardworking and friendly. He stayed late most nights, making sure everything was clean and secure before going home. Muhammad parked the Caprice in a position where Lee could see LaRuffa clearly. Lee climbed into the trunk through the back seat passage. He positioned himself with the Bushmaster rifle aimed through the hole in the trunk. LaRuffa locked the restaurant's front door and walked toward his car in the parking lot. Lee fired multiple times. The shots came in rapid succession. 5 bullets struck LaRuffa, hitting him in various parts of his body. LaRuffa fell in the parking lot, badly wounded. Muhammad drove the Caprice away immediately, disappearing into the night before anyone could identify the vehicle. But Muhammad wasn't finished. Before leaving the scene, they robbed LaRuffa. Lee took LaRuffa's laptop computer and approximately $3,500 in cash from the day's receipts. This wasn't just about killing anymore. Muhammad needed money to continue their operations, and robbery provided a practical benefit alongside the violence. Remarkably, Paul LaRuffa survived. Despite being shot 5 times, none of the bullets hit vital organs or major arteries. Someone found him bleeding in the parking lot and called for an ambulance. Paramedics rushed him to a hospital where doctors worked to stabilize him. LaRuffa underwent surgery and spent weeks recovering. 9 days passed. Muhammad and Lee stayed in the D.C. area, driving around, sleeping in the Caprice, and planning their next moves. Muhammad scouted additional locations. He observed how police patrolled the suburbs. He noted which areas had security cameras and which didn't. He prepared detailed mental maps of the region. On September 14th, around 10:10 p.m., they struck again. Muhammad drove to Silver Spring, Maryland, another suburban community north of D.C. They targeted the Hillendale Beer and Wine liquor store. Rupinder Benny Oberoi, a 22-year-old employee, was working the closing shift. He had emigrated from India and worked at the store to support his family while pursuing his education. Oberoi stepped outside the store for a moment. Lee had the Bushmaster rifle positioned through the trunk hole. Muhammad had the Caprice parked where Lee could see the store entrance clearly. Lee fired once. The bullet struck Oberoi in the back. He fell immediately. Co-workers inside the store heard something, but weren't sure what the sound was. When they realized Oberoi hadn't come back inside, someone went to check on him. They found him lying in the parking lot, bleeding from a gunshot wound. An ambulance arrived quickly. Paramedics worked on Oberoi at the scene before transporting him to a hospital. The bullet had caused serious damage, but Oberoi survived. He would spend time recovering from his injuries and would later participate in the civil lawsuit against Bushmaster Firearms and Bullseye Shooter Supply, seeking accountability for the negligence that allowed Muhammad and Lee to obtain the rifle. The next night, September 15th, Muhammad and Lee drove to Brandywine, Maryland. they found Three Roads Liquors, another liquor store in a suburban area. Mohammed Rashid was working as the clerk, preparing to close for the night. Rashid had no idea he was about to become the target of snipers who were testing their methods before launching a larger campaign of terror. Lee shot Rashid, who fell wounded but alive. The bullet hit him, but didn't cause immediately fatal injuries. Someone called for emergency services. Rashid was transported to a hospital where he received treatment. He would make a full recovery and later become an important witness. Mohammed now had 3 suburban Maryland shootings completed. 2 victims survived. 1 was shot 5 times. Police in different jurisdictions investigated these crimes but didn't connect them. Each appeared to be a separate incident. The shootings occurred in different counties, 9 to 10 days apart, at different types of businesses. Detectives had no reason to suspect a serial shooter was operating. This was exactly what Mohammed wanted. He was testing whether attacks spread across different jurisdictions would be investigated separately, or whether police would identify a pattern. The lack of coordination between agencies told Mohammed that his plan could work. He could attack multiple locations, and police would be slow to recognize they were dealing with a serial sniper. On September 21st, Mohammed and Lee expanded their range. They drove south to Atlanta, Georgia. At 12:15 a.m., they found Sammy's Package Store, a liquor store where Million A. Woldemariam worked. Woldemariam was a 41-year-old immigrant who had come to America seeking better opportunities. He worked hard to support his family and build a life. Woldemariam was helping the store owner close for the night when Mohammed and Lee arrived. This shooting differed from the others because they used a .22 caliber handgun instead of the Bushmaster rifle. Lee fired 3 times. 2 bullets hit Woldemariam in the head and back. He died at the scene. The store owner was devastated. Police arrived and processed the crime scene, collecting evidence and interviewing witnesses. But they had no leads on who committed the murder or why Woldemariam was targeted. 19 hours later, still on September 21st, Mohammed and Lee drove to Montgomery, Alabama. They targeted another liquor store. This shooting would later prove to be the most important mistake Mohammed made, though he didn't realize it at the time. Claudine Parker, a 52-year-old clerk, worked at the liquor store. She was friendly with customers and took pride in her work. Kelly Adams, a 24-year-old coworker, was also on duty that evening. They had no warning that their store had been selected as a target. Lee entered the store in what appeared to be a robbery. He fired multiple shots. Parker was hit in the chest. The bullet caused massive trauma, and she died quickly. Adams was shot through the neck. The bullet caused serious injury, but miraculously missed her carotid artery and other vital structures. She survived but required extensive medical treatment. In the chaos of the shooting, Lee dropped a gun magazine. It fell to the floor, and he left it behind when he fled. This magazine had his fingerprints on it. Lee didn't realize he had dropped it. Mohammed didn't know about it either. 2 days later, on September 23rd, Mohammed and Lee drove to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This was Mohammed's hometown, the place where he was born and raised. Returning to Baton Rouge demonstrated Mohammed's confidence that he wouldn't be caught. He felt invincible, untouchable by law enforcement. At 6:30 p.m., they targeted a beauty shop. Hong Im Ballinger, a 45-year-old woman who managed the shop, was shot in the head with the Bushmaster rifle. She died instantly. Ballinger had emigrated from Korea and built a successful career in Baton Rouge. She was respected in the community and known for her professionalism. Baton Rouge police investigated her murder but had nothing to work with. The shooting appeared random. Ballinger had no enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want her dead. The case joined the growing list of unsolved shootings connected to Mohammed and Lee. In less than 3 weeks during September 2002, Mohammed and Lee had killed 4 people and wounded 3 others across 4 states: Maryland, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. Each attack followed a similar pattern. Victims were targeted during routine activities at small businesses, shot from a distance, or during what appeared to be robberies, and left with no witnesses able to identify the shooters. Police in these different states didn't connect the crimes to each other. The attacks happened hundreds of miles apart. Some used the Bushmaster rifle, others used handguns. Some appeared to be robberies, others seemed motiveless. Each jurisdiction investigated independently, unaware that they were all dealing with the same two killers. This was exactly the confusion Muhammad had planned to create. By spreading attacks across multiple states and varying his methods, he made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to recognize a pattern. The September shootings had served their purpose as dress rehearsals and final tests. The modified Caprice worked perfectly. Lee performed his role without hesitation. The weapons functioned as expected. They could strike and escape without being identified. At the end of September, Muhammad and Lee positioned themselves for the main attacks. They were ready. Muhammad spent these last days of September driving through Montgomery County, Maryland, conducting detailed reconnaissance. This wasn't random exploration. Muhammad was selecting specific targets and planning precise attack sequences. He studied traffic patterns, noting when roads were busiest and when they were empty. He identified police patrol routes and timed how long it took for emergency vehicles to arrive at various locations after he triggered car alarms to test response times. He focused particularly on gas stations. These locations offered perfect conditions for his purposes. Victims would be standing still, vulnerable, focused on pumping fuel rather than watching their surroundings. Gas stations typically had open sight lines with few obstructions. They were located near major roads, making escape quick and easy. People visited gas stations constantly throughout the day, providing a steady stream of potential targets. Muhammad also studied shopping centers and their parking lots. He noted which stores had security guards and which didn't. He observed where security cameras were positioned and identified blind spots in their coverage. He looked for locations where the Caprice could park with clear views of pedestrians, but where the car itself wouldn't attract attention among other parked vehicles. Schools represented another category of target that particularly interested Muhammad. Attacking children would generate maximum terror and media attention. Schools had predictable schedules, with students arriving and leaving at specific times. Most schools had large open areas where students gathered outside. Muhammad drove past multiple schools, noting their layouts and security measures. He purchased a laptop computer to document his planning. Muhammad created detailed maps of Montgomery County and surrounding areas. He marked locations he had selected for attacks with icons. He drew routes showing how they would approach each location and which roads they would use to escape. He noted alternate routes in case their primary escape path was blocked. The planning was meticulous and methodical, the work of someone who had received military training in operational planning. Muhammad refined his timeline. He decided to launch the attacks on October 2, 2002. He would begin with multiple shootings in rapid succession to create maximum confusion and fear. Law enforcement would be overwhelmed, unable to protect everywhere simultaneously. While police scrambled to respond, Muhammad and Lee would continue attacking, demonstrating that no one was safe. During these final days, Muhammad talked constantly with Lee about their upcoming operation. He explained that what they were about to do would change American history. They would prove that a small group of determined individuals could paralyze the most powerful nation on earth. They would force the government to acknowledge their demands and pay the $10 million Muhammad would demand. Muhammad described in detail what they would do with the extortion money. They would drive to Canada, where Muhammad had already scouted potential locations for their base. They would establish a training camp in a remote area. Then Muhammad would begin recruiting young black men from broken homes, teenagers without fathers, boys who felt abandoned and angry, just as Lee had felt when Muhammad found him in Antigua. These recruits would be brought to the Canadian camp, where Muhammad would train them exactly as he had trained Lee. He would teach them weapons skills, tactical planning, and how to move undetected. He would condition them psychologically, breaking down their resistance to killing and rebuilding them as weapons. Then he would send them out across the United States to attack multiple cities simultaneously. Before we continue, if you're drawn into these real-life stories of crime, justice, and final moments, pause for a second. Hit follow, tap like, and turn on the bell so you never miss the next execution case or untold backstory. Every click helps keep these true stories alive, not to sensationalize them, but to honor the victims and understand the minds behind the crimes. Now, back to the October attacks. On October 1st, Muhammad made his final preparations. He cleaned the Bushmaster rifle thoroughly, ensuring it would function perfectly. He inventoried their ammunition supply and confirmed they had enough .223 caliber rounds for the planned attacks. He checked the Caprice's mechanical condition, topping off fluids and verifying the tire pressure. He tested the rifle through the trunk hole one more time to ensure the modifications hadn't shifted or changed. Muhammad also prepared psychologically for what came next. He knew the October attacks would be different from the September shootings. The September attacks had been spread across multiple states over several weeks. The October attacks would be concentrated in one geographic area over a short time period. This would generate intense law enforcement response. Every police agency in the region would be hunting for them. As darkness fell on October 1, 2002, Muhammad and Lee slept in the Caprice in a quiet parking lot in Montgomery County. They had done this countless times over the previous months, sleeping in the car, living out of fast food restaurants, showering at truck stops. This was their normal routine. But as Muhammad and Lee drifted off to sleep in the Caprice on the night of October 1st, they had no idea that their plan contained the seeds of their own capture. October 2, 2002 started as a normal Wednesday in Montgomery County, Maryland. People woke up, got ready for work, sent their children to school, and began their daily routines with no awareness that this day would shatter their sense of safety forever. The weather was pleasant, typical for early fall in the Washington, D.C. area. Temperatures were mild, the sky was clear, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Muhammad and Lee woke up in the Caprice where they had spent the night. They had parked in a quiet area where the car wouldn't attract attention. Muhammad started the engine and drove to a fast food restaurant where they bought breakfast. They ate in the car, as they had done countless times before. Around 5:20 p.m., Muhammad drove the Caprice into the parking lot of the Michael's Craft Store at 2 Halpine Plaza in Aspen Hill. The store was located along Randolph Road, a busy commercial corridor. Other stores and restaurants surrounded the Michaels. People came and went constantly, shopping, running errands, going about their lives. Muhammad positioned the Caprice where Lee would have a clear shot through the store's large front windows. Lee climbed through the passage into the trunk. He lay flat, positioned the Bushmaster rifle through the hole near the license plate, and aimed through the scope. The rifle's magnification brought his view into sharp focus. Inside the store, Ann Chapman worked as a cashier at the checkout counter. She was helping customers, scanning items, making change, doing her job as she did every shift. Through the rifle scope, Lee could see her clearly. The rifle fired. The .223 caliber bullet traveled at high velocity through the air. It struck the large plate glass window at the front of the store. Glass shattered, exploding inward in a cascade of fragments. The bullet continued through the store, passing close to where Chapman stood, but it missed her. She wasn't hit. For a moment, confusion filled the store. The sound of shattering glass was loud and shocking. Chapman and other employees ducked instinctively. Customers dropped to the floor, unsure what had happened. Was it an accident? Had something fallen? Had a car crashed into the building? Chapman realized quickly that she had nearly been shot. She saw where the bullet had passed through the window, saw the trajectory that brought it terrifyingly close to where she stood. Her heart pounded, her hands shook. Other employees rushed over to check if she was hurt. She wasn't injured, but the psychological impact was immediate and profound. Someone called the police. Montgomery County officers responded to the report of a shot fired at the Michaels store. They arrived to find the broken window, frightened employees, and confused customers. Officers searched for shell casings in the parking lot, but found none. Lee had fired from inside the closed trunk of the Caprice, so the spent shell casing remained inside the vehicle. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts of what they had seen or heard. No one had noticed the blue Caprice or connected it to the shooting. The car looked ordinary, like thousands of other sedans in the area. Mohammed had driven away calmly after the shot, not speeding, not drawing attention. Within minutes, they were miles from the scene. Police treated the incident as vandalism or possibly a stray bullet from somewhere nearby. Chapman had not been injured, so the urgency was lower than if someone had been shot. Officers took statements, photographed the damage, and filed a report. They had no reason to think this was an attempted murder or the beginning of something much worse. 1 hour later, at 6:30 p.m., Mohammed drove the Caprice to a different location in Montgomery County. They arrived at Shoppers Food Warehouse, a large grocery store at 2201 Randolph Road in Wheaton, about 4 miles from the Michaels store. The parking lot was busy with people finishing their workday shopping. Cars filled the spaces. Customers pushed shopping carts. People loaded groceries into their vehicles. Mohammed parked the Caprice in a position that gave Lee a clear view of the parking lot. The location was perfect. Multiple shoppers moved through the lot, providing several potential targets. The parking lot's layout allowed for a quick exit onto Randolph Road, where they could blend into traffic. James D. Martin had just finished shopping. Martin was 55 years old, married, and worked as a program analyst for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He lived in Silver Spring with his wife Sharon. He was a dedicated government employee who took his work seriously and was well respected by his colleagues. His co-workers described him as quiet, competent, and reliable. Martin was an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. He had stopped at the grocery store on his way home from work, as millions of people do every day. He bought the items on his list, paid at the checkout, and pushed his cart out to the parking lot. He reached his car and began loading grocery bags into the trunk. Lee had already climbed into the trunk of the Caprice. He positioned the Bushmaster rifle through the hole and scanned the parking lot through the scope. He saw Martin loading groceries, standing still, completely focused on his task and unaware that anyone was watching him. Lee centered the crosshairs on Martin's chest. He controlled his breathing, found the respiratory pause, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The bullet crossed the parking lot in a fraction of a second. It struck Martin in the chest, causing massive trauma. Martin collapsed between parked cars, falling heavily to the pavement. Grocery bags dropped around him. His car keys fell from his hand. Other shoppers heard the shot. The sound echoed across the parking lot, but most people couldn't identify what they had heard or where it came from. Some thought a car had backfired. Others thought someone had dropped something heavy. A few realized it was a gunshot, but they couldn't see the shooter or understand what was happening. Someone screamed. People began running for cover, ducking behind cars, rushing back into the store. A man who had been walking nearby saw Martin fall and rushed over to help. He found Martin bleeding heavily, unconscious, critically injured. The man shouted for someone to call 911. Other shoppers ran to assist. Some had medical training and tried to help Martin while waiting for an ambulance. They checked for a pulse, tried to stop the bleeding, but the damage was catastrophic. The bullet had struck vital structures in Martin's chest. His injuries were not survivable. Mohammed drove away from the parking lot immediately after the shot. He merged into traffic on Randolph Road, driving at normal speed, obeying traffic laws. The Caprice looked like any other car on the road. No one noticed it. No one connected it to the shooting that had just occurred. An ambulance arrived at Shoppers Food Warehouse within minutes. Paramedics rushed to Martin and began emergency treatment. They worked quickly, professionally, doing everything possible to save his life. Montgomery County Police responded in force to the grocery store shooting. This was different from the Michaels incident an hour earlier. This was a fatal shooting in a busy public location. Detectives arrived to process the crime scene. Officers established a perimeter, keeping people away from the area where Martin had fallen. They searched for shell casings, bullet fragments, and any evidence that might identify the shooter. The scene was chaotic. Witnesses gave statements, but accounts varied wildly. Some people said they saw a white van in the parking lot. Others mentioned seeing a truck. Some heard the shot clearly, while others weren't sure they had heard anything unusual. No one had seen the actual shooter or could describe a suspect. Detectives interviewed Martin's wife Sharon, who was devastated. She had expected her husband to come home from work with groceries. Instead, she received the worst news possible. Martin had been killed randomly, senselessly, while doing something as mundane as shopping for food. There was no explanation, no reason, no warning. Investigators initially treated the shooting as a possible robbery gone wrong, though nothing had been stolen from Martin. They considered whether Martin had been specifically targeted, but his wife and colleagues said he had no enemies, no conflicts, no reason anyone would want to harm him. He was a quiet government employee who lived a peaceful, unremarkable life. October 3, 2002 began at 7:41 a.m. Muhammad drove the Caprice to a mobile gas station in Aspen Hill, Maryland. Morning commuters filled their tanks before work. James Sonny Buchanan Jr., a 39-year-old landscaper, was mowing grass at the Fitzgerald Auto Mall across from the gas station. Lee positioned himself in the trunk. He aimed at Buchanan through the scope. He fired. The bullet struck Buchanan and he fell. Co-workers rushed over, but Buchanan was dead. The sound of the lawnmower faded as paramedics arrived. Muhammad drove away before anyone realized what happened. 26 minutes later, at 8:07 a.m., Muhammad stopped the Caprice near another gas station, this one in Aspen Hill as well. Prem Kumar Walekar, a 54-year-old part-time cab driver, stood at a gas pump filling his taxi. Lee fired once. Walekar collapsed at the pump. Other customers saw him fall, but didn't immediately understand he'd been shot. By the time they realized and called for help, Muhammad and Lee were gone. Walekar died at the scene. The shootings were happening so fast that police hadn't even finished processing the first scene when the second call came in. Dispatchers sent available units, but confusion was growing. Were these connected? Was there a serial killer in Montgomery County? At 8:12 a.m., just 5 minutes after killing Walekar, Muhammad drove to the Leisure World Shopping Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. Sarah Ramos, a 34-year-old woman, sat on a bench outside the shopping center. She was waiting for a bus. Lee aimed from the trunk and fired. The bullet hit Ramos and she slumped forward on the bench. A passerby thought she had fainted until they saw blood. Ramos died before the ambulance arrived. Muhammad kept driving. Lee stayed in the trunk, ready for the next target. They had 3 victims in 31 minutes. But they weren't finished. At 8:37 a.m., Muhammad drove to a Shell gas station in Kensington, Maryland. Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, a 25-year-old mother, was vacuuming her van. She had dropped her children at daycare and was cleaning her vehicle before work. Lee fired from inside the trunk. Lewis Rivera was struck and fell. Another customer at the gas station ran over, thinking she had collapsed from a medical emergency. Then he saw the wound. Lewis Rivera died at the scene, leaving behind young children. By 9 a.m., Montgomery County Police realized they had a crisis. 4 people dead in slightly over an hour, all shot from distance, all in public places. The chief of police, Charles Moose, mobilized every available officer. Roadblocks went up across the county. Police stopped and searched white vans and box trucks because early witness reports mentioned seeing such vehicles near the crime scenes. But these witness reports were wrong. Muhammad was driving a blue sedan that looked like thousands of other cars on the road. While police searched for white vans, Muhammad and Lee continued their work. At 9:20 that evening, more than 12 hours after the morning shootings, Muhammad drove to a residential area in Washington, D.C. Pascal Charlot, a 72-year-old retired carpenter, was walking home along Georgia Avenue at Calmia Road. Lee fired from the trunk. Charlot was hit and fell on the sidewalk. A neighbor heard the shot and ran out to find Charlot bleeding. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but he died less than an hour later. By the end of October 3, 2002, 5 people were dead. James Buchanan, Prem Kumar Walekar, Sarah Ramos, Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, and Pascal Charlot. All had been going about their normal daily activities. None had any connection to each other or to Muhammad and Lee. They were random targets selected for maximum impact. The news media descended on Montgomery County. Television stations interrupted regular programming with special reports. Newspapers prepared front-page stories. The nation learned about the sniper attacking the Washington, D.C. suburbs. Parents kept children home from school. People avoided gas stations. Fear spread throughout the region. Police worked around the clock, but they had almost nothing to go on. The shooter left no shell casings at most scenes. Witnesses provided contradictory descriptions of vehicles. Ballistics would eventually show the bullets came from the same rifle, but that didn't help identify who was firing it. Muhammad and Lee drove through the night, avoiding police roadblocks. They stayed in the Caprice, sleeping in parking lots or on quiet side streets. Muhammad was pleased with the day's results. They had shown they could strike anywhere, anytime, without being caught. October 4, 2002, brought a brief pause. No shootings occurred that day as Muhammad and Lee laid low, watching the news coverage of their attacks. Every channel showed the same images: yellow police tape, crime scene investigators, and frightened residents. But the break was temporary. On October 7th, at 8:09 a.m., Muhammad drove to Benjamin Tasker Middle School in Bowie, Maryland. Iran Brown, a 13-year-old student, arrived at school. His family had recently immigrated to the United States. His mother dropped him off at the entrance. Lee aimed carefully through the hole in the trunk. He fired once. The bullet struck Iran in the chest. The boy fell on the steps of the school. Students screamed and ran inside. Teachers rushed out to help. An ambulance arrived quickly. Iran Brown survived, but his chest injury was serious and required extensive medical treatment. At the crime scene, investigators found something new: a tarot card. Specifically, they found the death card from a tarot deck. On the front of the card, someone had written, "Call me God." On the back, on 3 separate lines, was a message: "For you, Mr. Police. Code, call me God, and do not release to the press." Chief Moose told his team to keep the tarot card secret, hoping to use it to identify the real shooter from false tips. But within 24 hours, WSA-TV reported the card's existence. The Washington Post followed with details. The information was public, frustrating investigators who wanted to control what the killer knew about their investigation. The shooting of a child at school brought new urgency. Montgomery County Public Schools immediately went into lockdown. Outdoor activities were canceled. Recess was held indoors. Physical education classes moved to gymnasiums. Parents picked up their children rather than letting them take buses or walk home. The pattern of the shootings became clear: random victims, single shots from distance, quick departures. Police realized they were dealing with a skilled shooter who had military-level training. The precision of the shots and the discipline of leaving immediately suggested professional expertise. On October 9th at 8:18 p.m., the shootings resumed. Dean Harold Myers, a 53-year-old civil engineer from Gaithersburg, Maryland, stopped at a Sunoco gas station in Manassas, Virginia. He pumped gas into his car. Lee fired from the trunk of the Caprice. Myers was hit in the chest and died at the scene. This was the first shooting in Virginia, expanding the geographic range. Police in Virginia joined the investigation, which now involved multiple jurisdictions and dozens of agencies. The FBI established a joint operations center to coordinate the response. October 11th brought another victim. Kenneth Bridges, a 53-year-old businessman from Philadelphia, stopped at an Exxon station near Fredericksburg, Virginia. He was traveling on Interstate 95, heading south for a business trip. At approximately 9:30 a.m., he stood at the pump. Lee fired. Bridges fell, mortally wounded. He died at the scene. Police set up massive roadblocks on I-95, stopping and searching hundreds of vehicles. They were still looking for white vans and box trucks. Muhammad drove the blue Caprice right past several roadblocks without being stopped. His vehicle didn't match the description police had given to officers. The next shooting happened on October 14th. Linda Franklin, a 47-year-old FBI intelligence analyst, finished shopping at a Home Depot in Falls Church, Virginia, with her husband. They loaded purchases into their car in the parking lot at 9:15 p.m. Lee fired from across the parking lot. The bullet struck Franklin in the head. She died instantly. Her husband, standing next to her, wasn't injured. The murder of an FBI employee escalated the investigation. The FBI committed even more resources. Federal agents joined local police in a massive task force. The attack also showed that no one was safe, not even law enforcement professionals. By mid-October, the region was paralyzed with fear. People ran between their cars and buildings in a zigzag pattern, hoping to avoid being hit. Gas stations erected tarps to shield customers from sightlines. Schools remained on high alert. Many residents simply stayed home, avoiding any unnecessary trips outside. The psychological impact was enormous. Muhammad had achieved his goal of creating widespread terror. But he wasn't done yet. On October 19, 2002, Muhammad and Lee drove to Ashland, Virginia, about 83 miles south of Washington, D.C. It was 8 p.m. when they arrived at a Ponderosa Steakhouse parking lot. Jeffrey Hopper, a 37-year-old man, finished dinner with his wife Stephanie. They walked toward their car. Lee fired from inside the trunk. The bullet struck Hopper in the torso. He fell in the parking lot. Stephanie screamed for help. Other customers ran out of the restaurant. Someone called 911. Hopper was conscious but badly injured. What made this shooting different was what investigators found afterward. Muhammad had left a 4-page letter in the woods near the steakhouse. The letter was placed in a plastic bag and attached to a tree. This was the communication police had been hoping for, even though it brought more questions than answers. The letter began with a cover sheet that said, "For you, Mr. Police, call me God, do not release to the press." The letter demanded $10 million. It instructed police to deposit the money in a Bank of America account that would have unlimited withdrawal capability worldwide. The letter complained about police telephone hotlines. Muhammad and Lee had apparently tried to call police several times, but the operators either didn't take them seriously or couldn't understand what they wanted. The letter specifically named some operators and called them incompetent. It said their failure to respond has cost you 5 lives. The most disturbing part was a direct threat. Your children are not safe anywhere at any time. This sentence confirmed everyone's worst fears. The shooters had already targeted a 13-year-old boy at school. Now they were explicitly threatening children. The letter ended with specific instructions. It gave a phone number for a booth outside the Ponderosa restaurant and told authorities to a way to call there. It warned, "If stopping the killing is more important than catching us now, then you will accept our demand, which are non-negotiable." The letter also included the phrase, "Word is bond," which investigators later learned has roots in Jamaican culture and reggae music. Chief Moose held a press conference and carefully referenced parts of the letter without revealing its full contents. He said, "Our word is our bond," and asked the shooters to contact them again. He was trying to establish communication while protecting operational details. The letter also mentioned a previous shooting in Montgomery, Alabama. Muhammad specifically told police to investigate that case. This was a crucial mistake. When investigators looked into the September 21st shooting at the Alabama liquor store, they found that someone had dropped a magazine at the scene. That magazine had fingerprints on it. On October 17th, authorities matched those fingerprints to Lee Boyd Malvo. His prints were on file because of his December 2001 arrest by Border Patrol in Washington state. Once they had Malvo's identity, they researched his background and found his connection to John Allen Muhammad. ATF records showed Muhammad had been seen with a Bushmaster rifle in Tacoma, Washington. Federal agents discovered Muhammad had a restraining order against him from his ex-wife, which legally prohibited him from possessing firearms. This gave them grounds for a federal weapons violation charge. Meanwhile, on October 22nd, the final shooting occurred. Conrad Johnson, a 35-year-old bus driver, was standing on the steps of his Montgomery County ride-on bus at 5:56 a.m. in Aspen Hill, Maryland. He was preparing to start his morning route. Lee fired from the Caprice. Johnson was hit and fell. He died shortly after. Johnson was beloved in his community. He was a father and a dedicated public servant who drove the same route every day. His death devastated the neighborhood he served. By October 22nd, police had identified Mohammed and Malvo as suspects. They issued a bolo, "Be on the lookout," for Mohammed, Malvo, and the blue Caprice with New Jersey license plate NDA 21Z. The information went to police departments across the region. It was also released to the media and broadcast widely. Truckers were specifically asked to watch for the vehicle since highway travel made it easier to spot. Mohammed and Lee didn't know police had identified them. They continued to sleep in the Caprice, driving around the area, watching the news on a small television Mohammed had brought. They saw their vehicle description broadcast, but apparently didn't believe police would actually find them. On the evening of October 23rd, Mohammed drove to a rest stop on Interstate 70 in Myersville, Maryland. He parked the Caprice in a parking space. He and Lee settled in for the night. The rest stop was relatively empty. They felt safe enough to sleep. What they didn't know was that a truck driver had seen the broadcast about the blue Caprice and its license plate number. As he pulled into the same rest stop around 11:45 p.m., he noticed a blue Caprice matching the description. He wrote down the license plate, NDA 21Z. It matched exactly. The truck driver called 911 from his cell phone. He reported the location and the vehicle. Dispatchers immediately contacted the FBI and local police. Within minutes, law enforcement began moving into position. This was the moment they had been waiting for. After 3 weeks of terror and 13 shootings across multiple states, they finally had the snipers cornered. All they had to do was approach carefully and make the arrest without anyone getting killed in the process. At approximately midnight on October 24, 2002, police and federal agents began surrounding the rest stop on Interstate 70. They moved quietly, without lights or sirens. Maryland State Police, Montgomery County SWAT officers, FBI hostage rescue team members, and ATF agents took positions around the parking lot. The blue Caprice sat in a parking space with Mohammed and Lee sleeping inside. Police didn't know exactly how many people were in the vehicle or whether they were awake. They didn't know if the killers had spotted them and were preparing to fight. The FBI hostage rescue team took the lead. These agents specialize in high-risk arrests and hostage situations. They approached the Caprice from multiple angles, using vehicles and barriers for cover. Snipers positioned themselves with clear sight lines to the car. If Mohammed or Lee attempted to shoot at officers, the snipers were authorized to return fire. At 3:19 a.m., the team moved in. Officers surrounded the Caprice with weapons drawn. They shouted commands for the occupants to show their hands and exit the vehicle. Bright spotlights illuminated the car. Mohammed and Lee were asleep when the shouts woke them. They were surrounded before they could react. Mohammed later said he considered reaching for the rifle in the trunk, but realized it was impossible. Officers ordered them to exit slowly, with their hands visible. Mohammed and Lee complied. They got out of the car one at a time, following exact instructions from officers. They were ordered to lie face down on the pavement. Officers approached cautiously, handcuffed them, and moved them away from the vehicle. The arrest was completed without any shots fired. After 3 weeks of living in fear, residents of the Washington, D.C. region learned that the Beltway snipers were in custody. The news spread quickly. People gathered around televisions to watch the coverage. Relief mixed with exhaustion and grief for the victims. With Mohammed and Lee secured, investigators began processing the Caprice. What they found confirmed their worst fears and provided crucial evidence for trial. The car had been completely modified to serve as a mobile sniper platform. The trunk showed clear modifications. A hole approximately 2 inches in diameter had been cut near the license plate. The edges were rough but functional. From inside the trunk, someone lying prone could aim a rifle through this hole and fire at targets while remaining completely hidden. The back seat had been altered. Sheet metal connecting the passenger compartment to the trunk had been removed, creating a passage. Lee could climb from the back seat into the trunk while the car was moving. From outside, the Caprice looked like a normal vehicle. Investigators found the Bushmaster XM15 rifle in the trunk. The weapon had a Bushnell holographic sight attached. Malvo's fingerprints were on the rifle. Mohammed's DNA was also found on it. Ballistics testing would later match this rifle to 11 of the 14 shootings, including all 10 fatal shootings in the D.C. area. Also in the car was Paul LaRufa's laptop, stolen during the September 5th shooting in Clinton, Maryland. The laptop contained maps that Muhammad had created. He had marked shooting locations with icons. He had drawn escape routes from several crime scenes. The level of planning was remarkable. Police found the Chevrolet Caprice owner's manual. FBI laboratory technicians later discovered written impressions on the manual, evidence that Muhammad had written some of his demand letters while using the manual as a hard surface underneath his paper. A digital voice recorder contained messages Muhammad and Lee had prepared for police. These recordings made extortion demands and threats. The voice on the recordings was later identified as Muhammad's. The car also contained maps of various cities, walkie-talkies, that Muhammad and Lee used to communicate during planning phases, and other items connecting them to the shootings. Evidence technicians photographed and cataloged everything. Muhammad and Lee were taken to separate facilities for questioning. Initially, both invoked their right to remain silent. But Lee eventually began talking to investigators. He was 17 years old, far from his mother, and facing the reality of what he had done. Lee told investigators about the relationship with Muhammad, though his initial statements protected Muhammad by claiming Lee himself was the triggerman in every shooting. He described their travels across the country and the various shootings. He provided details only the actual shooters would know. Muhammad refused to cooperate. He sat silently during interrogations, offering no information. His military training had taught him discipline. He gave his name and basic information, then said nothing else. Within hours of the arrest, police held a press conference. Chief Charles Moose announced the capture. He thanked the truck driver who had called in the tip. He acknowledged all the agencies that had worked the case. He expressed sympathy for the victims and their families. Following the arrests, investigators worked to connect Muhammad and Lee to all the shootings. They had the modified Caprice, the Bushmaster rifle, and Lee's initial statements. But they needed more to ensure convictions in multiple jurisdictions. Ballistics testing at FBI laboratories confirmed the Bushmaster rifle found in the Caprice was used in 11 shootings. Technicians compared bullets recovered from victims and crime scenes to test fires from the seized rifle. The markings matched precisely. This linked Muhammad and Lee to 8 of the 10 fatal October shootings in the D.C. area, plus the killing of Hong Ballinger in Louisiana and 2 other shootings. Some early shootings used different weapons. The September 21st shooting in Atlanta and the Montgomery, Alabama shooting both involved a .22 caliber handgun rather than the Bushmaster rifle. This explained why ballistics didn't initially connect all the crimes. Investigators traveled to Tacoma, Washington, to research Muhammad and Lee's time there. They interviewed neighbors who remembered seeing Muhammad and Lee target shooting in the woods. One neighbor, Robert Holmes, testified that Muhammad had introduced Lee to him as a sniper. Muhammad had also discussed making a silencer for the rifle, according to Holmes. Police talked to staff at Bullseye Shooter Supply, the gun store where Lee had shoplifted the Bushmaster rifle. Store records were incomplete, but ATF audits showed Bullseye had lost track of 238 guns in the 3 years before the sniper attacks. More than 50 guns from Bullseye had been traced to crimes between 1997 and 2001. The store's negligent practices made it easy for Lee to steal the rifle without detection. Investigators examined Muhammad's background thoroughly. They learned about his military service, his expert marksmanship badge, and his Gulf War deployment. They reviewed his custody battle with Mildred Muhammad, a restraining order she had obtained. They discovered he had kidnapped his 3 children in 1999 and fled to Antigua. They interviewed Mildred Muhammad, who told them about Muhammad's increasingly erratic behavior before he disappeared with their children. She described threats he had made and his obsession with maintaining control. She lived near the Capitol Beltway in Clinton, Maryland, right in the area where several shootings occurred. Prosecutors developed a theory that the shootings were ultimately about Muhammad's desire to kill Mildred and regain custody of his children. The random shootings, they argued, were meant to establish a pattern so Mildred's death would look like another sniper victim. But the judge later ruled there was insufficient evidence to prove this theory, so it wasn't presented to the jury as motive. Investigators also researched Lee's background. They contacted his mother, Una James, in Florida, who was devastated. She told them about meeting Muhammad in Antigua and how he had seemed like a positive influence on her son. She never suspected Muhammad was grooming Lee for violence. Immigration and Naturalization Service records showed Lee had entered the United States illegally and was arrested near the Canadian border in December 2001. Una had posted bond for his release. Border Patrol officers remembered the case. School records from Bellingham High School showed Lee had been enrolled under the name John Lee Malvo, with Muhammad listed as his father. Teachers described Lee as quiet and withdrawn. He hadn't made friends or participated in activities. No one had suspected he was being abused and trained to kill. Forensic psychologists evaluated Lee. They concluded he had been subjected to intense psychological manipulation by Muhammad. The combination of isolation, abuse, indoctrination, and Lee's vulnerable state made him susceptible to Muhammad's control. Defense attorneys would later argue Lee was not capable of refusing Muhammad's orders. Evidence also emerged about the grand plan Muhammad had described to Lee. Malvo told investigators about Muhammad's scheme to extort $10 million and use the money to establish a training camp in Canada. Muhammad wanted to recruit other vulnerable boys, train them as he had trained Lee, and send them out to commit attacks across the country. Phase 2 of the plan involved bombing a police funeral to kill many officers at once. These revelations shocked investigators. They had stopped the attacks just in time. If Muhammad and Lee had successfully extorted the money and escaped, they might have carried out an even larger campaign of terror. Prosecutors in multiple jurisdictions wanted to try Muhammad and Lee. Virginia, Maryland, Alabama, Louisiana, and Arizona all had shootings connected to them. Washington State had the February 2002 killing of Kenya Cook. Each state wanted justice for its victims. U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft made the decision to let Virginia proceed first. Virginia still allowed the death penalty for juveniles at that time, and Virginia juries were historically more likely to impose death sentences than Maryland juries. The decision was strategic. Prosecutors wanted the strongest possible outcomes. This decision meant Lee could potentially face execution, even though he was 17 during the shootings. Muhammad, as the mastermind and adult in the partnership, was the primary target for the death penalty, but prosecutors wanted the option to seek death for Lee as well. The evidence package was overwhelming. Ballistics, physical evidence from the car, witness statements, fingerprints, DNA, maps, stolen property, and Lee's own admissions created a comprehensive case. Prosecutors felt confident they could convict both defendants. The question wasn't whether Muhammad and Lee were guilty, but what their ultimate sentences would be. In October 2003, John Allen Muhammad's trial began in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The trial had been moved there from Prince William County because extensive pre-trial publicity made it impossible to find impartial jurors in the original venue. Muhammad was charged with the October 9, 2002 murder of Dean Harold Myers at the Manassas gas station, plus 3 additional charges: murder with intent to terrorize, conspiracy to commit murder, and illegal use of a firearm. The prosecution, led by Paul Ebert, spent 6 weeks presenting evidence to prove Muhammad orchestrated the murders and ordered Lee Malvo to help carry them out. They called 130 witnesses and introduced over 400 pieces of evidence. The case was largely circumstantial, since no eyewitness saw Muhammad pull the trigger. Key evidence included the Bushmaster rifle found in Muhammad's car that ballistics linked to 8 of the 10 D.C. area killings, plus 2 others in Louisiana and Alabama, the modified Caprice with the shooting hole in the trunk, and a laptop containing maps with shooting locations marked. Lee Boyd Malvo testified at Muhammad's trial, though his testimony was complicated. He initially claimed to be the triggerman in all shootings to protect Muhammad from the death penalty, But under cross-examination, his story shifted, and he provided details about Muhammad's role as planner and leader. The defense argued that prosecutors hadn't proven Muhammad personally pulled the trigger and pointed out Lee's fingerprints were on the rifle. However, Virginia law allowed capital murder convictions for both the actual killer and the person who ordered the killing when the crime involved terrorism. After 6 weeks of testimony and 6 hours of jury deliberation, on November 17, 2003, the jury found Muhammad guilty on all 4 counts. A separate penalty phase followed where prosecutors presented evidence of Muhammad's lack of remorse and continuing threat to society, while the defense presented mitigating evidence about his difficult childhood and military service. On November 24, 2003, the jury recommended the death penalty, which the judge formally imposed on March 9, 2004. Muhammad showed no emotion when the sentence was pronounced. Lee Boyd Malvo's trial began in Chesapeake, Virginia in November 2003, shortly after Muhammad's conviction. Lee faced 2 capital murder charges, killing FBI analyst Linda Franklin in an act of terrorism and killing more than 1 person within 3 years. He also faced a firearms charge. The venue had been moved to Chesapeake due to pretrial publicity. Judge Jane Maram Rausch presided. The prosecution team was led by Robert Horan, a veteran prosecutor known for handling complex cases. Lee's defense team included Craig Cooley, a prominent Richmond attorney, along with Michael Arif, Thomas Walsh, and Mark Petrovich. The core argument was that Malvo had been so completely controlled and manipulated by Muhammad that he wasn't mentally capable of forming criminal intent. His attorneys included Craig Cooley and others who presented forensic psychologists to explain how Muhammad had systematically broken down Lee's sense of self over 2 years through isolation, abuse, indoctrination, and creating complete dependency. The defense presented evidence of Muhammad's grooming tactics, showing how he alternated between praise and criticism to control Lee's behavior, which is classic predatory manipulation. Social worker Carmeta Alvarez testified about breaking through Muhammad's psychological control during jail visits. Lee himself testified, describing how Muhammad seemed caring when they first met and gradually took over his life, making him feel powerless to refuse orders. The prosecution vigorously challenged this defense, arguing that Lee was intelligent, knew right from wrong, and had opportunities to ask for help but never did. They emphasized that Lee made active choices, including stealing the rifle, getting into the trunk, and pulling the trigger. The jury deliberated for nearly 14 hours over 2 days before finding Lee guilty on both capital murder charges and the firearms charge on December 18, 2003, rejecting the insanity defense. During the penalty phase, prosecutors sought the death penalty, but Lee's youth and the abuse he suffered created more sympathy than Muhammad received. On December 23, 2003, the jury recommended life in prison without possibility of parole rather than death, and Judge Rausch formally sentenced Lee to life on March 10, 2004, to be served at Red Onion State Prison, Virginia's Supermax facility. After the Virginia convictions, both Muhammad and Lee faced charges in other jurisdictions. In October 2004, Lee entered an Alford plea in Spotsylvania County, Virginia. An Alford plea means the defendant doesn't admit guilt but acknowledges prosecutors have enough evidence to convict. Lee pleaded to murdering Kenneth Bridges at the Fredericksburg gas station and attempting to murder Caroline Sewell at the Spotsylvania Mall. He received an additional life sentence without parole, plus 8 years for firearms charges. He also agreed not to appeal his conviction in the Linda Franklin case. This plea deal was strategic. By pleading in Spotsylvania, Lee avoided another death penalty trial. Prosecutors in Prince William County had also wanted to try him, but that case was dropped after the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in March 2005 that executing juveniles was unconstitutional. The Supreme Court's decision in Roper-Simmons meant Lee could no longer face execution for crimes he committed at age 17. This removed the death penalty from consideration in any future trials. Prosecutors in other states had to decide whether spending money on trials for additional life sentences made sense when Lee was already serving multiple life terms. Maryland authorities decided to prosecute both Muhammad and Lee for the 6 Montgomery County murders. James Martin, James Buchanan, Prem Kumar Walekar, Sarah Ramos, Lori Ann Lewis Rivera, and Conrad Johnson. In May 2006, Virginia and Maryland reached an agreement to allow Maryland to proceed. Lee was transferred to Maryland under heavy security. The prosecution agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for Lee's cooperation and testimony against Muhammad at his Maryland trial, prosecutors would not seek additional death penalties. Lee pleaded guilty to all 6 murders. On November 8, 2006, a Maryland judge sentenced Lee to 6 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. Combined with his Virginia sentences, Lee faced 10 life terms plus 8 years. Unless laws changed, he would die in prison. Muhammad's Maryland trial occurred in May 2006. Lee testified against him, providing details about their relationship and the planning of the attacks. After extensive psychological counseling in prison, Lee had finally begun telling the truth about who pulled the trigger in various shootings. Lee admitted he had lied during Muhammad's first trial when he claimed to be the sole triggerman. He testified that he said this to try to save Muhammad from the death penalty. Now, Lee explained Muhammad's role as the planner, leader, and participant in the shootings. Lee also revealed more details about Muhammad's grand plan. He testified about the scheme to extort money, establish a training camp in Canada, recruit homeless boys, and send trained shooters across America to commit attacks. This testimony showed the scope of Muhammad's ambitions. Muhammad was convicted in Maryland and received additional sentences. However, Virginia had jurisdiction for his execution based on his first conviction there. Maryland's additional convictions didn't change his ultimate fate. Other jurisdictions considered filing charges, but ultimately decided against it. Arizona could have prosecuted them for Jerry Taylor's March 2002 murder. Louisiana could have charged them with Hong Ballinger's death in Baton Rouge. Alabama had the September liquor store shooting. Georgia had Million Woldemariam's murder in Atlanta. Washington State had Kenya Cook's February 2002 killing in Tacoma. But prosecutors in these states concluded that additional trials weren't necessary. Muhammad already faced execution in Virginia. Lee already had multiple life sentences. The Legal Action Project of the Brady Center to Prevent Gun Violence filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of survivors and victims' families against both Bullseye Shooter Supply and Bushmaster Firearms. The lawsuit's central argument was that the negligent business practices of these companies directly enabled Muhammad and Malvo to obtain the weapon used in the attacks. The suit detailed how Bullseye operated with such careless disregard for security and record-keeping that guns routinely disappeared from their inventory without explanation. Federal records documented that 238 guns were completely unaccounted for over a 3-year period, and more than 50 firearms that had originated from Bullseye had already been traced to criminal activities before the sniper attacks even occurred. The lawsuit further argued that Bushmaster Firearms bore responsibility because the company continued supplying weapons to Bullseye as a dealer, despite being aware of the store's extensive record-keeping violations and the pattern of guns disappearing from their inventory. The case was scheduled to go to trial in April 2005, but the parties reached an out-of-court settlement in September 2004 before trial began. Under the terms of the settlement, Bullseye Shooter Supply agreed to pay $2 million, and Bushmaster Firearms agreed to pay $550,000, for a total settlement of $2.5 million. Importantly, neither company admitted any wrongdoing or liability as part of the settlement agreement. Bushmaster stated publicly that they settled because their insurance company had already spent half of their policy limits on legal defense fees, and continuing to fight the case would exhaust all remaining coverage, so they chose to use the remaining funds for the victims' families instead. Bullseye similarly characterized the settlement as a practical decision rather than an admission of fault. Despite the lack of admission of liability, The settlement was considered significant by victims' advocates because it represented the first time a gun manufacturer had agreed to pay damages related to the negligent distribution of a weapon used in criminal shootings, and it was the largest settlement amount ever paid by a firearms dealer in such a case. After sentencing, Lee Boyd Malvo began his life sentence at Red Onion State Prison in Virginia. Red Onion is a supermax facility designed for the most dangerous inmates. Prisoners spend 23 hours per day in their cells, with 1 hour for recreation in a small enclosed area. The conditions were harsh. Cells measured approximately 8 by 10 feet. A steel bed, toilet, and sink were the only furnishings. Prisoners had minimal contact with others. Guards communicated through small openings in solid steel doors. The isolation was intentional, meant to prevent violence and maintain control. Lee had time to think about what he had done. His attorneys and a social worker, Carmeta Albaris, continued visiting him. They helped him process his experiences with Muhammad and understand the psychological control he had been under. Slowly, Lee began to separate his real identity from what Muhammad had created. In September 2012, Lee gave a lengthy interview to the Washington Post. It was his only face-to-face media interview. He called himself a monster for what he had done. He expressed remorse and said he had spent years working through guilt while in solitary confinement. Lee explained that without access to therapy or counseling programs, he had to be his own therapist. He read extensively, thought about his actions, and tried to understand how he had become a killer. He said he dealt with his guilt piece by piece over many years. In October 2007, Lee reached out to Cheryl Witz, the daughter of victim Jerry Taylor, who was killed in Arizona. Lee called her to apologize. This began a correspondence between them. Witz later became one of the people supporting Lee's resentencing efforts, believing he deserved a chance at eventual parole given his age and circumstances. In February 2010, Lee sent a handwritten letter to John Gaeta, who survived being shot in Louisiana. Lee wrote, "I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you and your loved ones. I was relieved to hear that you suffered no paralyzing injuries and that you are alive." Gaeta appreciated the apology but said it didn't erase what happened. Lee attempted to change his name in 2011, arguing he would be safer if other inmates didn't recognize him. A Virginia judge denied the request, ruling that name changes for safety reasons should be handled through prison security measures, not court orders. Lee married in 2020 while in prison. Virginia allows prisoners to marry under restricted conditions. The ceremony took place at the prison with limited witnesses. Lee's attorney, Craig Cooley, attended and later said he believed Lee and his wife were soulmates. The bride's identity was kept private. Meanwhile, legal battles continued over Lee's sentences. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. The court said sentencers must consider a juvenile's age and circumstances before imposing the harshest sentence. In 2016, the Supreme Court ruled in Montgomery v. Louisiana that the Miller decision applied retroactively. This meant juveniles sentenced to mandatory life without parole before 2012 were entitled to new sentencing hearings. Rather than continue fighting in court, Virginia and Lee's attorneys reached an agreement. They dismissed the pending Supreme Court case. Lee's life sentences would remain in place, but he could seek parole under the new law. In August 2022, the Virginia Parole Board denied Lee's first parole request. He can apply again in the future. In June 2024, Lee was transferred from Red Onion State Prison to Keene Mountain Correctional Center, a lower security facility for inmates serving life sentences with no recent disciplinary infractions. This transfer suggested Lee had behaved well and wasn't considered as dangerous as when first imprisoned. For John Allen Muhammad, he spent his final years on death row at Sussex State Prison in Virginia. Death row conditions were similar to supermax facilities: solitary confinement, minimal contact with others, and limited recreation time. The cells were small and sparse, designed to house men awaiting execution, rather than those serving life sentences. Muhammad lived in this isolation, separated from the general prison population, his days marked by routine and waiting. Throughout his incarceration, Muhammad maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. He never admitted pulling the trigger or planning the attacks. He showed no remorse for the victims or their families. To Muhammad, his prosecution was not justice but persecution. He remained convinced that his case was a racist plot against him, a belief he held firmly until his final breath. Muhammad filed multiple appeals challenging his conviction and death sentence. His main argument centered on Virginia's triggerman law. Muhammad's attorneys argued that prosecutors hadn't proven he personally fired the fatal shot that killed Dean Myers. Lee had testified inconsistently about who shot whom during various attacks. Without direct evidence that Muhammad pulled the trigger, his lawyers claimed he couldn't be executed under Virginia law. Virginia courts rejected this argument repeatedly. The state's law allowed capital murder convictions for both the actual killer and the person who ordered the killing when certain circumstances existed. The terrorism element of Muhammad's crimes made him eligible for capital murder charges regardless of who fired specific shots. As 2009 progressed and Muhammad's execution date approached, his attorneys made final appeals to Virginia Governor Tim Kaine. They asked the governor to commute Muhammad's sentence to life in prison. They argued Muhammad had mental health issues stemming from his difficult childhood. They pointed to the loss of his mother at age 3, his father's abandonment, and the trauma he experienced growing up without stable parenting. Governor Tim Kaine reviewed the case thoroughly but declined to grant clemency. He found no reason to overturn the jury's verdict and the multiple courts that had reviewed the case over 7 years. "I think crimes that are this horrible, you just can't understand them. You can't explain them," Kaine stated publicly. "They completely dwarf your ability to look into the life of a person who would do something like this and understand why." On November 9, 2009, the day before his scheduled execution, Muhammad's final appeal was denied by the U.S. Supreme Court. There would be no last-minute reprieve. The execution would proceed as scheduled. On November 10, 2009, John Allen Muhammad rose from his prison cot for the final time. His movement was steady and measured, not of a man fighting fate, but one who had already surrendered to it. By early afternoon, Muhammad sat with his family for the last time. Among them was his son, Lindbergh Williams, a man who had come not to forgive, not to condemn, but simply to understand. For 2 hours, father and son faced each other across the sterile walls of death row. The conversation was brief, stripped of the weighty last words that often mark such moments. "We stood there and just looked at each other for about, I want to say, a good 3 minutes. No word said, no anything," Williams later recalled. "It was a meeting between two strangers, bound by blood, but little else. As they sat across from each other, they couldn't ignore the resemblance. I think we both were doing the same thing, like, that's my nose, you have my ears," Williams admitted. So, we were both checking each other out. Muhammad had spent years shaping Lee Malvo into a killer, but he hadn't been a father to Lindbergh Williams for a very long time. Now, with only a few hours left, his son gave him the chance to bridge the gap. "We only have a couple more hours before I would never be able to talk to you again," Williams told his father. "Is there anything you want to tell me? A story from when you were my age? Something you need to get off your chest?" But Muhammad had nothing left to say. The silence stretched between them. For Williams, the visit was a final attempt to connect with the father he never truly knew. But even facing death, Muhammad remained an enigma, unwilling or unable to open himself to his son. As the final family meetings concluded, Muhammad sat with his attorneys one last time. There was little left to discuss. His appeals were exhausted. The governor had denied clemency. The execution would proceed. Muhammad remained unchanged in these final hours, calm, quiet, and resolute. To the end, he refused to accept the court's ruling as justice. Minutes before 9 o'clock in the evening, John Allen Muhammad was escorted into the execution chamber at Greensville Correctional Center. Flanked by guards and dressed in denim prison clothing, he stepped into the small room where a cross-shaped gurney awaited him. His steps wavered just slightly, reminiscent of how people had walked 7 years earlier during his attacks on Washington, D.C., when residents moved cautiously, never in a straight line, bobbing and weaving as they walked, never knowing if they were in a killer's sights. There was no ceremony, no hesitation. The execution team moved with efficiency, securing his arms, legs, and torso with thick leather and nylon straps. The process was methodical and precise, practiced many times before. Muhammad offered no resistance. He lay on the gurney as the team completed their preparations. At exactly 9 o'clock in the evening, the execution team stepped back. The warden approached and spoke the required words. "Mr. Muhammad, do you have any last words?" Silence. No plea, no apology, no defiance. Muhammad did not turn his head or lift his eyes. He simply lay there unmoving, as if the question had never been asked. Prison spokesman Larry Traylor, who watched as an official witness, later told reporters, "He did not even look at us or acknowledge us." From the moment he entered the chamber to the moment the needle found his vein, Muhammad never uttered a single word. After a signal from the warden, the execution team administered the lethal injection protocol through intravenous lines inserted into Muhammad's arms. Virginia used a 3-drug sequence: sodium thiopental to induce unconsciousness, pancuronium bromide to paralyze muscles and stop breathing, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. The drugs were administered at 9:06 in the evening. For a moment, there was stillness. Then a twitch, a blink. Muhammad took 7 deep breaths, each one slower than the last, until there were none. His chest stopped rising. His body went completely still. At exactly 9:11 in the evening, John Allen Muhammad was pronounced dead. The warden made the formal announcement: "The execution of John Allen Muhammad has been carried out under the laws of the Commonwealth of Virginia." Death was pronounced at 9:11 p.m. The time didn't go unnoticed. Among those present, a murmur spread through the witness area. "Oh, the irony in that," one witness remarked quietly. He was pronounced dead at 9:11. The coincidence struck many as symbolic, though it was purely accidental. Muhammad had reportedly expressed sympathy for the September 11 attacks and reportedly admired those who had carried them out. Now he died at 9:11, a time that would not be forgotten. The execution was completed without complications. Muhammad's body was removed from the chamber and taken to be prepared for release to his family. Outside the prison, people had gathered on both sides of the issue. Some held vigils opposing the death penalty, carrying signs and candles, praying for an end to capital punishment. Others supported the execution as justice for the victims, believing Muhammad deserved to die for the terror he had inflicted. The execution marked the end of John Allen Muhammad's life, but not the end of the story. Leigh Malvo remained in prison, serving multiple life sentences and navigating complex legal battles over his juvenile sentencing. Victims' families continued dealing with their losses, some finding ways to move forward, while others remained trapped by grief and trauma. The story of John Allen Muhammad is a chilling reminder of how one man's rage can hold an entire nation hostage, and how evil can wear the face of discipline, intelligence, and control. 10 innocent lives were stolen, families shattered, and cities paralyzed by fear. But behind every headline and execution lies a question we still must face. What drives a man to become a monster? And could it happen again? If stories like this move you, share them, not to glorify the crime, but to remember the victims, understand the darkness, and push for a future where justice doesn't come only after blood has been spilled. Follow for more true execution stories, final confessions, and last moments behind America's death chamber walls. Every case has a heartbeat, until it doesn't.